welcome you here tonight. We're very excited to have Amy with us, and we'll say more about Amy in just a moment. But we're very, very happy to have everyone here. I'm going to begin with a little prayer, and this is actually words to a hymn. The hymn was written in the 1800s, and I was fortunate to be at a conference in interdenominational conference in New York the past few days, and every morning we would begin with prayer at 9:15, which is a very civilized hour, I think, right? And it was just a magnificent experience. But many of the hymns were unfamiliar to me. Certainly one written in the 1800s, much as some of you might think, well, weren't you around then? But the words to it were rewritten about 100 years later. So I just thought these words were beautiful and probably very appropriate for what we are going to be talking about this evening. So if you will pray this as I read the words. The title is "Oh for a World." Oh for a world where everyone respects each other's ways, where love is lived and all is done with justice and with praise. Oh for a world where goods are shared and misery relieved, where truth is spoken, children spared, and equality achieved. We welcome one world family and struggle with each choice that opens us to unity and gives our vision voice. The poor are rich, the weak are strong, the foolish ones are wise. Tell all who mourn, outcasts belong, who perishes will rise. Oh, for a world preparing for God's glorious reign of peace, where time and tears will be no more, and all but love will cease. And now I'd like to ask Jane Heschel to come up and introduce our speaker this evening. I'm sorry. Pam Heschel will come up. We have so many Janes in our group that they're all Jane to me.
So, my name's Pam Heschel, and I'd like to introduce Amy Sandrolini to you. Amy's a Huron native. She went here to high school in Huron. After she graduated, she went to Syracuse University. And since then, she's been spending most of her life overseas working. Her mother is a Huron resident that goes to St. Christ Episcopal Church. Amy's an Emmy award-winning journalist turned human rights activist, and she's got more than 15 years of global experience in the counter-trafficking field. Her work's taken her to roughly 50 different countries where she's seen firsthand the individual and collective effects of poverty, the lack of opportunity, the breakdown of law, and human trafficking. She's worked to combat human trafficking at the U.S. Embassy to the Vatican and the world's largest human rights agency, the International Justice Mission. She currently serves as Vice President of Communications with the Exodus Road. The Exodus Road is a nonprofit committed to collaboration with local law enforcement to combat sex trafficking of minors by rescuing the victims and arresting their perpetrators. This organization is headquartered in Colorado Springs, and it currently has offices in Thailand, India, and Latin America. It was born out of the recognition of the lack of and the absence of human trafficking intervention efforts. Their main focus has been to empower teams of undercover investigators to work alongside national law enforcement partners. These search and rescue teams are comprised of highly trained and vetted nationals who gather evidence of human trafficking and facilitate rescue operations. Through almost 8 years in the intervention sphere, TER has facilitated the rescue of more than 1,150 victims of sex trafficking and the arrest of almost 600 perpetrators. Here's Amy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Give me one moment. There may be a lock on this. We need a password. But while you're doing that, that's all right. Good evening again, everyone. Let me thank the St. Peter Peace and Justice team for having me here this evening to speak about human trafficking, which is most certainly an issue that erodes peace and requires great, great justice. So I am very honored to be here under your umbrella and invitation this evening. I also just want to thank all of you. I'm quite moved looking out here tonight, and I see so many friends who are really family. It is a great gift for me to be here tonight to speak about what I have done over the last 17 years that has, in great part, longer than that even, has kept me away from many of you and kept me away from my mother, who's not in the room tonight. So this is an issue that I care deeply about, and it is a great gift to be able to share about it with you, because it is an issue that is affecting Ohio. The last time I was in this room was 2011, and I had the great pleasure to be here with a dear friend and a great mentor of mine, a Catholic nun, Sister Eugenia Bonetti. And I see some of you shaking your heads. I know Jane was here facilitating that evening. I was reminded she had gifted this batik of the Madonna from Nigeria when she was here on that visit, and there's a picture of her at the entrance. She is a dear, dear friend, like a mother, like a sister, and a real sister. She is also an internationally renowned human trafficking hero, and she has greatly influenced my journey. So I want to give you an update on some of the important things that have changed since I was here in 2011. First of all, the Catholic Church has elected a new pope. Now, Pope Benedict certainly addressed the issue of human trafficking. He made it an issue that he spoke about often, but Pope Francis has really made it a priority of his papacy, and for this I'm very pleased. Sister Eugenia, in fact, is one of his advisors, and the first time she was introduced to Pope Francis, she was introduced as the Mother Teresa of prostitutes. And she is very proud of that title. She wears it well. And she, in all sincerity, is quite close to Pope Francis. And this last Lent, I don't know if any of you followed the Ways of the Cross on Good Friday that is conducted at the Colosseum in Rome. But she was tapped to write the meditations for the Ways of the Cross. It was broadcast around the globe, and she wrote those meditations to focus on human trafficking and its victims. Another thing, Sister Eugenia and I, since we were last here, have worked on this book that was written about Sister Eugenia. I did not write it, but I did translate it from Italian to English, and I'm going to leave some of these copies here with the church if you get a chance to get a copy. It does tell the story, a very gripping story of how she got into the work. She has been rescuing, restoring victims of human trafficking for 25 years now. She is worthy of reading this book if you can get your hands on it. Another thing that has changed since 2011 is that human trafficking has gotten worse. When I began working in this field, I talked about the issue. There were 27 million victims globally, which is the number I would use. It's an estimate, but it would include sex trafficking victims and labor victims, and labor trafficking victims, and 27 million. Today, the number I'm going to share with you is about 40 million. So yes, we've become more aware, but yes, the issue has also gotten worse. So I do feel a pressing need to talk about this issue anywhere I go. And it's a heavy issue, and I thank you for being here tonight to open your hearts and your minds to learning about it and taking some of it with you. The more you know, in my experience, it can't help but change you a bit. But that's what I hope we're going to do together tonight is learn and open our hearts and minds to this issue a bit. So with that, I'm going to move into my presentation here. And no, I could continue, but I think we'll have better luck if you do. Yeah. Anyway, while we are getting the slideshow presentation up, just so I get a sense of how many people know or have known about the issue of human trafficking. Okay, oh, that's wonderful. How many would say they know a lot about the issue? Okay, well then we will learn together. And I think if you go, you got it. Slideshow and full frame. Great. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I work currently in Colorado Springs for an organization, a nonprofit, that's called the Exodus Road. You heard that in the introduction. And our methodology is to collaborate with local law enforcement to gather investigative data to motivate and move and enforce law enforcement to go and rescue victims and also arrest their perpetrators. We are headquartered in Colorado Springs, but we have offices in India, in Thailand, and Latin America. And as you heard, in 8 years of this methodology of collaboration with local law enforcement, we have rescued over 1,100 victims, and this number is outdated now, but have arrested 600 perpetrators. So human trafficking goes by many names. It goes by trafficking in persons or modern day slavery. And there are many different aspects of it. There is labor trafficking, there is organ trafficking, and we work at the Exodus Road in the very narrow lane of combating sex trafficking with a focus on minors, those under the age of 18. And this here is a free resource, The Truth About Sex Trafficking, which is available on our website, theexodusroad.com. And it will include many of the statistics I'm going to share with you tonight. But just as I encourage you to educate yourselves, this is a free resource that is available to you. I recently returned from the front lines of our work in Thailand and India just a month ago. And that trip crushed me in many ways, because even in all the years I have worked in this field, 17 now, I had never seen sex, prostitution, also sex trafficking in the way that I had seen it, particularly in Thailand. And I could sit here and try to explain it to you. I would fall short of doing that effectively. And I think the best way to bring you into at least the work that we do overseas is to share some undercover footage with you about that. And then from there, we can talk a little bit more. We'll have some common visuals and language. But let me tell you what you're going to see in here. You will see some statistics on the video. And I did not make this, but this video does try to do a lot of things. I think it may try to do too much. So focus on the video. We'll talk about the statistics after. You will see sex for sale in Thailand. You will see showrooms where girls are brought in for sale, for viewing. Notice you may see some of them wearing actual numbers. You also see residential brothels in India. You'll see rescues, our teams working undercover with local law enforcement rescuing. You'll see pimps with profits and a few other things. And anyway, after the video, we will, I'll discuss it. hard to describe, right? It's also hard to see. Has anyone seen anything quite like that before? Maybe yes? So as I said, that trip devastated me. I just never seen it so boldly done. It was done with great audacity and with great magnitude. So I came back from that trip convinced of three things more than I'd ever been convinced of them before. And that is, number one, global human trafficking is intimately connected to domestic trafficking. The problem is bigger than I had imagined, and I'm more convinced than ever that every single one of us can do something about it, which is why I stand before you tonight. So, though if we're going to address a problem, I believe deeply that we first need to understand how it was created. And if we expect anyone to be a part of the solution, they need to be convicted of the fact that they can be a part of the solution. So I'm going to work real hard to do those two things tonight. And I'm going to start with a brief history lesson. I'm going to go back to more than 100 years ago in this country, and I want to share a quote by the great slave turned abolitionist turned statesman, Frederick Douglass. And this quote describes the very harsh terms of his time. He wrote, "No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." This is my personal belief and the foundation of my faith. And any of us who were in church last Sunday heard the gospel reading the Good Samaritan. This is that, in other words, in my opinion. And it also is a bedrock of my argument of why each of us need to understand the mechanisms of human trafficking, the indicators, and what we can do if we see it. Because I deeply believe our freedom is intimately related to the freedom of others, and our human dignity is intimately related to the human dignity of every other person. And until we actually believe that and walk our talk, we're not going to really be able to do anything about this issue. So who knows what this is? I heard a slave ship. Yep. Right. It is a slave ship, and this is not just any slave ship. This is the Amistad. This is the scene of a great slave revolt from 1839, a successful slave revolt. And this ship became the symbol of the abolitionist movement in the United States. And this. Anyone know what that is? Yep, it's the lower deck of the slave ship. And it is the blueprint for how that deck, and mind you, there were many decks on each slave ship, how it could be claustrophobically stuffed to the maximum for the maximum profit of slave traders. You can read the cargo holds: men, women, boys. So this maps out the strategic thinking of slave traders or traffickers. So for me, this is a business plan. It's how do I maximize my profit? And this, does anyone know what that is? Slave trade routes, right? And so this is another way for me to look at the business plan. And what are they trading there? Molasses, wine, sugar, cotton, slaves. And this, my friends, is a new way to look at that. But this was just, this is a modern day slave route. This is from 2013. The Protection Project every 6 years documents movement of slaves around the globe. This is one of their maps, the most recent map they have, that tracks movement of slaves to the United States. And as you can see, they come from just about everywhere. So today, traffickers are every bit as serious about their business as they were during the transatlantic slave trade. However, there are a few disturbing differences. As we know, they are no longer confined to slave ships. We've got trains, We've got planes. They use ships. But they move at much faster rates, and they can move much larger quantity of individuals. So their means now are global, and they're highly complex, and they're highly sophisticated. So as I said to you, 15 years ago I was talking about numbers, and again, these are all estimates. They're informed estimates, but this is an illicit business we're talking about. So I was using the number 27 million when I began my work, and now it's 40 million. Again, depending on what organization you look at, the numbers will vary, but I trust this number. In fact, I think it's probably low. And this does include labor and sex trafficking, majors and minors, boys and girls. I want to be clear about that. So here is another way of comparing the transatlantic slave trade with the modern day slave trade. And again, I think we need to know where we have come from to know where we are and to determine where we would like to go. So during the transatlantic slave trade, 300 plus years, it's estimated that there were about 12 million slaves that were bought and sold. Today we're looking at 40 million. During that time, a slave buyer would pay, in the equivalent of today's dollars, $40,000 for a life. And the methodology would be that a slave owner would buy a life, and usually that slave would stay with that person for the longevity of their life for the most part. The model is quite different today. So today we have 40 million, and a slave can be bought in some parts of the world, so a life, for the equivalent of $90. And the methodology has changed because the buyer of this slave now, again, I'm talking now about sex trafficking, that's the lane I stay in, but that slave then is sold over and over and over again for sexual profit, 5, 6, on average up to 10 times a night. And that is what, so this is rape for profit to the tune of $150 billion a year is what the profit margin on this illicit business is. It is second only behind the sale of drugs. It has surpassed the sale of arms, but it will quickly, I think, surpass the sale of drugs. It is the fastest growing illicit market in the world. So let us get into then what exactly is human trafficking. There's a legal definition, and the legal definition involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to get someone to do something against their will for the profit of someone else. And this definition is important because when it meets, or an act meets or uses force, fraud, or coercion, a case for human trafficking can be made. And that therefore triggers legal provisions for victims and penalties for perpetrators. So these three words are very, very important. Our trained investigators are always looking for proof of force, fraud, or coercion. And then in sex trafficking, if a victim is under the age of 18, it's a case of human trafficking. There is no such thing as a child prostitute. So a victim under the age of 18 can trigger provisions of human trafficking. So who are these 40 million victims? The largest percentage globally are in labor trafficking, followed by forced marriage. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. That's not a cultural phenomenon here in the United States, but there are cultures in which my company works in which forced marriage is widely, widely practiced. And the reason why it falls now, and this is only new in the last 5 years that they've begun to talk about forced marriage in the human trafficking sphere, but those, and I will call them victims of forced marriage in this case, are often under the age of 18, but more importantly, there is also often the use of force, fraud, or coercion in that. And we make no judgment on the cultural practice except to say if we're looking at force, fraud, or coercion or under the age of 18, it qualifies. Sex trafficking, the lane we work in, is the smallest percentage right now of victims. But let me just say also to my friends here who know my math has not ever been my strong suit. I know that these numbers add up to more than 100. And I know two in particular who are guessing about my math. But I know that, and And you can see the margins here between them are soft because often they overlap. Where there is labor trafficking, there is almost always sex trafficking, and vice versa. A few other very startling stats. My background is in journalism and also human rights with a focus on women and girls' rights and issues. And the reason being because this human trafficking, this crime disproportionately affects women and girls. 75% of victims in sex trafficking are women, though that trend is changing. My team in Thailand for the last 2 years, 80% of their work has been online, which I will talk about, and 80% of their victims rescued have been boys. So this is a changing dynamic field, but to date, disproportionately, it has affected women and girls and children. 25% are boys and girls. So let's now look at the revenue. That 12% that sat in the sex trafficking sphere contributes more than double of what labor trafficking does. So of $150 billion estimates over a year, 99 billion are attributed to profits from sex trafficking. So all I can say, there is a demand, and it is driving profits to, as I say, tune of 150 billion. So for me, or anyone else who wants to join me in this fight, we have our work cut out for us. There's a lot at stake. For the traffickers, the profits, and for us, lives. There is a lot resting in the demand, which is driving this business. Okay, let us now bring it home. So there are anywhere between 200 to 300,000 victims of human trafficking in the US every year. Now they may not stay here, they may pass through here. There are countries of origin, transit, and destination, but the United States is a country of origin, transit, and destination. Be sure, Americans are trafficking Americans in America at great rate, but they are also trafficking foreigners. And I'm sure you, many of you raised your hand, you are aware that human trafficking is certainly present here in Ohio. And in some cases, I'm sorry to have to say, it's thriving. Depending on what statistics you look at, Ohio as a state ranks 4th in the nation for prevalence of sex trafficking. Toledo, if you look at cities, ranks as 4th, or at least in the top 5, again, depending on what statistics you look at for a city of its size, for prevalence of sex trafficking. Again, this could be transit moving through, but nonetheless, I trust these statistics. So let's break it down a little bit more. So 4th in the US as far as state prevalence of sex trafficking. Recent estimates, 2018, say there were about 1,000 victims in Ohio. Again, at some point, either currently here, or originating here, or passing through. And why? The means are here. Ohio has 21 interstate highways, 5 of them considered major due to volume. We have a soft, porous border to our north. And also we have an incidence of very low awareness. But the state in 2012 started to get serious about the issue and created a task force. So there is a human trafficking task force in Ohio, which is quite active. And they also moved to put some teeth into our laws, and they raised the penalty for committing the crime of human trafficking to a first-degree felony with a mandatory minimum of 10 to 15 years. So there are good things. I'm not only the bearer of bad news, but there's some bad news I have to bear. So let us then now look at, on average, who are the players in this business, which is what it is. And I want to preface this by saying that this is on average. Each of these individuals in these roles can look very different, but we have to start somewhere to have the dialogue. We have to begin to know what to look for, or we're never going to see it. So again, the Exodus Road, we work on the issue of combating sex trafficking, and these are the players in that dynamic. Your average John or in code John is a sex buyer. There are Janes. There are certainly Janes. There are also Mama San, or women who are often trafficked themselves who then go on to traffic others. But your average sex buyer is a John. He's 47. He's married. Has 2 kids. He's highly educated. And he brings home a pretty good salary. Is that surprising to anybody? No? You've heard that. May not be who you were looking for initially, though. So you got to know these things. Again, these are averages, but you got to know who and what you're looking for. Your average victim, as I said, 25% tend to be under the age of 18. We've got a statistic here, 44% are under 17. Again, many different statistics, but they all point to the fact that a lot of these victims of sex trafficking are children. And they here, as I've told you, must perform, for the most part, on average, between 5 and 10 tricks or sexual acts a night. And then your John, or excuse me, your trafficker or your pimp, the best ones are chameleons. So they look many different ways in many different scenarios. The best ones are invisible. But in short, your average pimp runs what is called a stable, or the amount of girls or victims they are running, could be boys as well, 3 to 4, and they are running them, working them 7 days a week. And in Denver, this stat comes from a detective I work with in Denver on a human trafficking task force. Your average pimp in Denver pulls down $1.5 million a year. As I said, we've got our work cut out for us. There's a lot of incentive for people to stay in the business when the risks are low and the profits are high. So where are they doing their work? Let me ask you first, who would guess what the primary grooming or luring piece of equipment is for a human trafficker? What is it, the thing that they leverage or use the most often? Yes. This thing right here. How many of you know teens who have one of these? Maybe more than one of these. And when your average teen spends on average 7 to 9 hours a day online, and this is where traffickers are spending more and more of their time, I think you can see quickly the connection. So I believe we need to be talking to our young people in churches, in schools, at the doctor, anywhere we can. I feel we're negligent if we don't. So most of it is happening online. As I said, our office, I just got an update from my team in Thailand 3 days ago, and they had another rescue, and it was their cyber work online posing as potential traffickers, which led to a rescue. But more and more, 80% of their efforts now are focused online, data scraping, finding material, finding traffickers. So also schools, malls, school events, any place young people hang out, that's on average where it's happening. So exploitation. A few years ago, I wouldn't have told you that exploitation is happening for the most part online. But it is. It's moving there more and more. And reason being, as all of you likely know, right, you can buy almost anything online now from the privacy of your own home, including the rape of a young boy in front of a webcam in Thailand, in the Philippines, in the Midwest. The internet and technology this is what has made the difference between 27 million a few years ago and 40 million that I'm sharing with you tonight. You've got to take it seriously. So, and then you can also see, yes, it's happening, hotels, motels, a lot of it, the negotiation, the sale and the negotiation of the sale is done online, and then, yes, the actual exploitation or act is carried out in a hotel or motel. That definitely still exists. In India, that's more or less how it's done. There are brothels, as you saw in the video there. So yes, it does still take place in locales as well. Illicit massage parlors. I'm sure you heard in January, the Robert Kraft case cracked that wide open, that yes, illicit massage businesses are illicit. Not all of them, but some of them, and some of it is prostitution, but some of it is certainly sex trafficking as well. I will share, we followed that very closely in Colorado Springs. We have 36 massage parlors in Colorado Springs. And I'm sad to say that it's a disproportionate amount given the size of the city, but this tends to be the case in cities where there are military installations across the U.S. 36 in Colorado Springs. And then the last thing I want to point out as well is familial. Familial trafficking is a wide phenomenon, one we probably don't, for me it's most difficult to talk about, and this is where a actual family member or someone who would be considered in the family circle of a victim is responsible for the trafficking. And I have a very close and new friend in Colorado Springs. Kelly Dorr is her name. She's one of the bravest people I've ever met. She was trafficked by her biological father from the age of 2 to 14. And she did take him to court. He got a very, very light sentence. This was about 10 years ago when she took him to court. Laws have changed, but the point is she is the exception, that she has been able to take an experience like that and leverage it for good. Sadly, she is the exception, and nonetheless, she got the life sentence of aftercare and recovery. It's an everyday battle for her, but she's made it, more than most. Okay, vulnerabilities and indicators. Vulnerabilities. When we see these signs in individuals, in essence, on average, right, there's still an opportunity for intervention. There's still a chance for that. These are just indicators we need to look at. When you see a few of these, it's when we know that human trafficking may be fast approaching, if you will. Poverty, and I probably have naively said that we don't have to worry about poverty in Huron. I know a lot has changed in Huron since 2011 as well. And there are different types of poverty, right? There's poverty of family, there's poverty of self-confidence, a lot of things that lead to vulnerabilities. Mental illness, addictions. Traffickers leverage these things. They often use alcohol or drugs to lure or groom someone into the life, as they call it. Lack of opportunity. Oftentimes this is for those who come from other countries outside of the United States, but they come to the United States on a promise of a better job, and the job never fabricates. It is fabricated and never materializes. In fact, it's sex work in a brothel that the job ends up being. Cultural differences. I only want to point that out because many of these victims of sex trafficking that we have learned about in illicit massage parlors across the United States or anywhere else are kept there in great part because they don't have language. They don't have English. Number one, to know who to go to because their movement is limited, but also they don't have the language to actually express what's happening to them and ask for help. Experience of domestic violence. Someone who does not have family stability, who is accustomed to abuse, even if they know it's wrong, is also vulnerable to further abuse. So indicators. When we see indicators, there is likely a chance that there has been some trafficking or there is grooming. There is some kind of trauma that has entered into the life of the individual we're looking at. And as I say, when we get involved, in some ways it's too late to stop some damage from being done. But nonetheless, this is why education, again, is so important. Prevention is the best way to get at this. As I said, few victims, of course, come out unscathed, but committed to a life of constant effort for recovery. So indicators, signs of control. Traffickers use control of victims. They limit movement. If they are foreign and come into the U.S. with passports, those documents are taken, so therefore they would be in the country illegally. Another form of control. Minor, major relationship That refers to the fact that in many of these situations, the victim is a minor under the age of 18 with a much older person or trafficker. Signs of abuse, verbal, physical, emotional, and frankly, psychological and emotional is just as powerful a tool as physical. Cages come in many, many different forms. And signs of duress. So someone who is in this environment, of course, is going to be stressed or panicked, have a vacant look. Again, these are all just indicators that our teams are trained to seek out, and when we catch a few of these, we take quite seriously that human trafficking could be underway or has already taken place. So why do victims stay victims? Oftentimes, the question is asked, well, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they find a moment to run? And then first and foremost, let me say again, chains and cages come in many different forms. Psychological control is widely used. But also, first and foremost, a victim may not know they are a victim. They may have a deep sense that something is wrong, that what is being done is not right, but they don't understand or don't know that they actually have legal protections if they would come forward. It is a crime. Also, they may not consider themselves a victim. Like my friend Kelly, she did not know until she was 14 in a health class, and her friends responded in a violent and repulsed way to talking about incest and pedophilia, that she realized her story was not their story. She had assumed that every family had that kind of secret. Again, education to our kids who need to hear it most. Let me just go over a few more. So they also, this is a very complicated issue. Traffickers often, particularly in familial trafficking situations, protect their traffickers. The trafficker may have been, at some point, someone who provided protection for them or drugs for them. So the relationship between victim and trafficker can be very complex and very confusing and difficult to navigate always. And then victims stay victims because they are often isolated from any support system or any form of help that could actually get them out, and that's the trafficker's intent, of course. So if you see something, say something. We've all heard it, but I am here to reiterate what I have heard from so many law enforcement officers, every single one I've ever worked with. They say they would much rather have someone report something and be wrong than not report something and be right. Every single law enforcement officer I've ever spoken with has said that. So here are some things if you do see something. First and foremost, do not attempt to rescue yourself. If you are safe and you can gather some details that would be helpful to a law enforcement officer, then do so. Details of what the individuals look like, details of a car. If you could take a photo from a safe place, that would be usually the most helpful. Again, only if you are in a safe place. You could call 911, or better, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which will then route and alert the correct authorities. There's a number here to text as well. If you do anything, and I would hope our hosts this evening might be able to, in some follow-up after this, get these numbers to you. Best thing you could do, just put them in the phone. If you know what to look for, you may be surprised what you may find. And if you have any suspicions whatsoever, if you are right, the person who is in that situation may not have another chance to have someone help them. So you may be the person that makes a life-changing phone call. So further things that you can do, you're already here this evening on a summer night, and I thank you again for opening your heart and mind to come here this evening to learn about this heavy topic. But getting educated is the best thing you can do for yourself and for those you love. Polaris Project runs our National Human Trafficking Hotline. Their website is full of fantastic resources, and I trust all their statistics. Ohio, the Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force has a 50-minute online free training. You go to the website here, publicsafety.ohio.gov, and there's a 50-minute training that gives you specific facts about Ohio. Join a local human trafficking task force. There's not one in here as far as I know, so someone in this room be the first one to start one. Support nonprofits who are working in this field, and leverage your networks or your talent or your connections. Everyone has something to offer that can raise awareness or mobilize resources to, again, if not end, begin to stem the flow of this growing illicit business, one of the most pressing human rights issues of our day. And as I close, what I want to do now is just share a short video with my boss, who is one of a husband and wife team who started the Exodus Road, and why I firmly believe that everybody can do something is this husband and wife team 8 years ago went to Thailand from Colorado. They, Matt, who you will hear from, went to run a children's home. He knew nothing about human trafficking, but he got to Thailand, and soon after arriving, he heard that all the pretty girls were being sent from the villages to the cities. Struck him as odd, so he started to ask about it, and it was true. And he learned that they were being sent to the cities to be sold for sex. And it bothered him enough that he went to the local police and said, "Can I be of any help?" And they said, "You know, you could be. In our investigations, we need someone to pose as a Western John or sex buyer. Can you help us out?" And for 2 years, he worked with them to gather as much information as he could on video, observations, to inform rescues and arrests of perpetrators. Came back to Colorado and he couldn't get it out of his mind, and he said to his wife, he said, "You know, we've got to do something about this." She said, "You're right." And they started the Exodus Road. And 8 years later, 1,100 victims later, 600 perpetrators later, they're still going. So I want to share this video with you, and then I'll just come up and say a few more words and close.
Last year, I was on deployment with some of the Exodus Road operatives to Southeast Asia. I saw this Russian man and woman across the street right on the beach, and they were arguing. He hadn't hit her, but he had her by the wrist, and she was kind of, pulling against him. And I'm sitting here, and there's a street between us, and they're yelling, and basically he was trying to get her on the back of his little rental scooter that he had, and she didn't want to go. I just sat there watching this unfold, and a few of our operatives began to arrive, and a few of them are a little beefy, and so I just said, "Hey, hang here with me. We need to watch this." And so I made sure that the Russian guy knew that I was watching, and eventually it simmered down, and she ended up crying but getting on the scooter and leaving with him. It haunted me for months that I didn't cross the street. The reason it haunted me wasn't because I didn't cross the street because that was necessarily the right thing to do or wasn't the right thing to do. I didn't cross the street because I was afraid. For a while I tried to convince myself it was for some strategic reason, like, well, maybe it would have escalated it. But the truth is, I didn't rise up and cross that street because I didn't know what would happen to me. A few months later, I was back in the same city in Southeast Asia, one of the largest red light districts that I've ever seen. It was late, it was 3 a.m. We'd just come back from doing undercover work with our team. We were exhausted. I thought I heard this noise, and I knew instinctively in my heart, okay, someone's in trouble. And I went and I got one of our operatives, and we heard it again, and there was a woman in distress behind this hotel door, yelling, crying loudly, and a man yelling and sounding like he was hitting her. And there's this moment again where I don't know what's on the other side of this door. And I kind of have this choice. Am I going to knock on this door? Am I going to intervene? And I did. And I knocked on the door. Heart's pounding through my ears. and an older French man opens the door, and there's a Thai woman there just bawling her eyes out. This man spoke French, she spoke Thai, nobody spoke English. So all of a sudden I'm speaking Thai and remembering Thai words I haven't used in years, and I'm communicating to this woman, "Are you okay? And do you want to come with us?" And the French gentleman tried to push me out the door. I opened that door all the way, put my foot in the middle, and I looked at him, and in Thai, because he spoke Thai as well as French, I was like, "You have an anger problem. I'm not going anywhere." This story I'm telling you is the story of rescue in the hands of the ordinary. It is ordinary men and women who will cross the street, who will knock on the door even though they don't know what's on the other side, and sometimes that's risky.
I watch it so many times, and every time it gets me. And it gets me so deeply because it's actually true. Justice is in the hands of the ordinary. And at the Exodus Road, every single one of us is ordinary. Very ordinary. But we have an extraordinary belief that every single man and woman, and especially every single boy and girl, deserves somebody to be fighting for their freedom. And I believe at my core, I have a 7-year-old son at home, and his right to freedom is no more important than any single other child's freedom anywhere on this earth. And I do believe that every single one of us, in some way, shape, or form, if this is an issue that grabs your heart in any way, you have something you can bring to the table. And the last word I will say is, save it till the end. But before I began speaking, I got a update from my boss, just checking in. She knew I was going to be with you here this evening. And she let me know that we got an update from our Thai office. And today, a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old were rescued in Thailand just a few hours ago because of the efforts of our teams on the front lines. So justice is in the hands of the ordinary. So I thank you so much for being here this evening. I'm deeply touched and overwhelmed by so many of you here tonight. I would have been happy to speak to one person. I said I will speak to anyone who will listen, because that's how deeply I care about this issue. So thank you for being here tonight. I feel extremely encouraged. This can be hard and heavy work, and the fact that you are here this evening will carry me for a long way. So thank you so much, and again, thank you for being here this evening, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. Thank you, Father Jeff, as well, for having me.
If anybody has any questions for Amy? Well, as long as everybody can hear it.
It's always, scary for women to come forward because they're afraid for their lives, even if they, get rescued.
So for those of you who didn't hear the question, it was what type of protections can victims expect if and when they are rescued? And my global answer would be not nearly enough in general. In specific, it would depend on where the rescue is taking place. In the United States, it is deplorable, and I will use that word, the dearth of resources there are for people who are rescued out of human trafficking in specific. while I've been here the last week and a half, I've been trying to get placement for a 14-year-old sex trafficking victim who's come from Norway to the US. The trafficking happened in Norway, but she's in Colorado Springs with a family member, and I can't find a place to take her. Either the place that would take her is full, and the others now are concerned about the international aspect of it because they don't have the legal provisions or knowledge. So the short answer is not nearly enough protections. Ideally, law enforcement would be trained on victim-focused approaches. Many of them, most law enforcement teams have not had human trafficking training or human trafficking sensibility training. And then you would ideally hope they would find themselves to an aftercare shelter, and a long-term one, because recovery is lifelong, as I've said. And that is, as I say, we're in the intervention or rescue sphere of sex trafficking, but we partner in all the countries in which we work with trusted, victim-focused, trauma-informed aftercare partners who are residential and invested in long-term. There would be some skills building, there would be medical and psychological testing, counseling, and those are the partners who we work with. The same type of partners I worked with when I worked for International Justice Mission, or IJM. But my answer to you overall, sadly, is there are not nearly enough resources for these victims, the lucky ones who get out.
Amy, thank you for being here this evening. I have actually two questions. My brother-in-law is a retired detective from the Detroit area who's been working with a group in New York and in Washington, D.C., and they, for a year now, have been investigating and trying to prosecute a very prominent person. And he's traveled to 4 or 5 different countries, and their investigation has been privately funded by donations. And so I was wondering, what are the obstacles and the barriers to doing that kind of legal work to bring that justice? And my second question is, in the midst of, in our country, this increased disparity in resources, those that have and those that have not, how does that impact this issue?
Two very good questions. I will answer your first about the legal obstacles in bringing justice about. In the United States, you will notice the Exodus Road, we are headquartered in Colorado Springs, and our real focus is on now prevention, raising awareness, doing training. And the reason why we are not feet on the ground doing investigations in Colorado Springs or in the US anywhere is chain of custody laws. So, and that means any undercover footage or photos or data scraping material that we would have that we would put into a case against a potential trafficker or pimp, if you will. In the United States, the bar for that chain of custody is much higher than it is in second or third world countries, Thailand, India, or what have you. So police departments are reticent to work with any nonprofit or anyone outside of their own teams because that evidence may not ever be able to be brought into a court of law and or to be justified to move forces to actually make an intervention. We'll also say across the U.S., very few police forces have vice and human trafficking units. There is a dearth also of those who are focused on the issue, which is why I'm not surprised that this is privately funded. But the real issue, as I understand it, is when it comes to any evidence that is actually collected, it can easily be refuted on legal grounds by defendants. I hope that answers your question. In my lane, that's my understanding, and it's why we, unfortunately, our majority of our work in the United States is we have a cyber operations center at our headquarters, and we are working with US-based police online. We're also working with police forces around the world because, of course, the internet is global, and we're very effective there. We're one of the few organizations with the cyber tools, very advanced cyber tools, and very advanced operators of those tools. As far as the other, the haves, have-nots, the financial disparity, victims whether they be Americans in America or foreigners in America or anywhere else, are, again, they fall into that poverty or that disparity where there is a vulnerability created by lack of monies, or again, emotional poverties as well. So those who have needs, traffickers are trained and laser focused on seeking out those vulnerabilities. And if someone also is financially in difficult straits, a trafficker will use that to offer a false job or fees for a sexual act one-on-one, and there are many different ways that they leverage that vulnerability. But the majority of your victims, not all, because some are also now coming from very lucrative families, but on average, they fall in the bucket of economic poverty. But it's important to know not only. There are many victims also who come from affluent families, affluent neighborhoods, who are educated as well. But it's some vulnerability that the trafficker will hook.
Does anybody else have a question?
Do the traffickers keep the victims into drugs to hold them in place?
So the question, do traffickers use drugs to keep victims in place? And absolutely. The majority of cases where we work, that is used. Either it's used during the grooming stage, or an addiction or dependence is created during the trafficking stage. And so many times the day-to-day reality of victims is unspeakably difficult. They welcome the drugs. They welcome the numbing. Yeah.
As large as this program is, or this problem is, once you rescue a victim, I'm just going to refer to the state of Ohio. You answered part of it with individuals that you can try to depend on to help provide these kids with some semblance of a normal life again. I'll call them kids. But does the state have programs and facilities that will take care of those that you identify as victims and rescue?
Most states do not, or if they do, they're minimal, and the majority of them also are not long-term. Most often in the states, and I preface this by saying my experience and expertise is really overseas, but now that we're here in the US and getting more engaged, many human trafficking victims end up in domestic violence shelters or homeless shelters, because we've tried to address across the nation those two problems. But last I knew across the US, and that's probably a hard number a year ago that I trust, 17 shelters specifically, exclusively for sex trafficking victims, and very small facilities at that. So there are just a few dozen beds at best for sex trafficking victims. And someone who is a sex trafficking victim needs very different services than someone who is struggling with domestic violence recovery, or homeless recovery, or drug recovery. It is a very specific trauma, and therefore specific services need to be offered. And there is a dearth of those resources across this country. That is my answer. And my answer is vague because there aren't specifics to speak to, unfortunately.
Amy, would you give us an update on Sister Eugenia? We were so blessed to have her here with you in 2011, and I know there have been some issues in her health, and would you share those with our audience, please?
Yeah, Jane, thank you so much for the question. Sister Eugenia has really been a driving force in my life, personally and professionally. And she had, as I had mentioned, a great highlight this Lent, having Pope Francis ask her to produce these global meditations. But in the last week, she's let me know that she has a blocked artery in her brain and is undergoing some testing this week and next. And it's likely quite serious. And so I appreciate you asking the question, and I would also ask that you would keep her on your heart and on your prayer lists. She is brave all the way through it, and she knows very well that the good Lord is the only reason she is still here all these years later. And she will fight to the very last, and her spirits are good. But the issue is quite serious. So thank you for the question, and I would thank you in advance for any prayers you can throw up for this good, sturdy Catholic nun. She needs them right now. She's all of her years of praying out. If some of them could come back to her, that would be great. That would be great.
I probably don't need a mic. So,
You don't sound like the man who needs a mic.
So, the whole thing's crazy. But so there's people that are making money that are pimps. Okay?
Correct.
And I don't understand them, but it's greed. That's that.
It's greed.
So you've got kids who have nowhere else to go, or their situation. But the user, is there a consequence, at least here, for that?
I love the question. Thank you. It's what I call the demand question.
Right, yes.
Which, exactly. And I thank you for the question, because it is the aspect that has most often been overlooked. And I personally think it is the aspect that can best be addressed in the church.
I could give you a good consequence.
Yeah, I could come up with a few myself. But I do believe it is ultimately a question of this.
Yeah.
So the church is beautifully positioned to address it. I have to say, in my opinion, no church, the Vatican included, has addressed sufficiently the demand question. But it is a heart question ultimately. What is missing and so broken? But it's also a legal question. And there has not been sufficient focus on the user. That is also beginning to change. There were not laws that were often, had either existed, they do now, but had not existed prior for the John. That is certainly changing. And more as we begin to talk about demand, and we begin to create laws and put teeth into them, I believe that will begin to change. And there was something else I was going to say that is escaping me. I'll come back to it, but the point is that is the issue that has been greatly overlooked, and I'm so glad you asked it. And if my other point comes back to me, I will share it.
So is there legislation, or I know that the legislature bring this up, but is there any legislation in the country or Ohio about?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And it goes state by state for sure. And there are laws against the user. As I said, more and more of them in focus. And thank you. You helped prompt me to what I was going to say. So I had also been quite dismayed by the fact that users, that John was overlooked. When my work began in Italy, Johns were never brought in because prostitution is legal in Italy. Aiding and abetting it, no. So the John was never brought in, but the victim was dragged in for not having documents and then forcefully repatriated. But just spoke with this detective who I quoted earlier who works on the issue in Denver, and he explained why the John is often the one that escapes punishment. And the reason being, they're so difficult to track down, because that is a variable in the equation, right? When a girl is having 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 guys a night, and they're all different, the two variables are the victim and the trafficker. And so therefore, with limited resources, They have to go where they're going to get the best ROI, return on investment. And thank you for prompting that, because it's an important point. But with the limited resources, the limited training even for law enforcement, the Vice and Human Trafficking Unit in Colorado Springs has to deal with drugs, guns, burglary, day-to-day things that the cops get called to look into. If they're lucky, they get to a human trafficking lead. And it takes weeks, if not months, to gain the trust of either a trafficker and or a potential victim to begin to get a little bit of information to begin to build a case. It is arduous work. It is heartbreaking work. And it takes a lot of time. And most law enforcement departments, unfortunately, don't have it.
Put me in charge. I'll fix it.
Grab my card and I'll grab yours. We might just change the world together, I don't know. Got a firecracker back there.
Amy, has there been a standardized training program put together for middle school or high school kids?
Another one of my favorite questions from a teacher, right? Because, Shar, there are many now beginning to be created, right? The media has finally gotten a hold of this issue and is beginning to talk about it, and awareness is raising. Most of you raised your hand when I said, have you heard of human trafficking, which is great. But the short answer, or let's just say the answer is yes, programs exist, but there is no requirement in schools right now across the country. California is moving in that direction. Colorado and some districts is moving it to say, yes, we are going to require human trafficking training in our schools. But I am praying and hoping and will do whatever I can to advocate that schools require some level of human trafficking training and awareness for students, but also for teachers and also for administrators. Because it is at this point, given the statistics, given what we know, let alone what we don't know, we are, I believe, negligent in not bringing this training to those who need it most. So thank you for the question.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Kate.
So I work at the high school level with a very vulnerable community, and we do have people come in and speak to our students. It's not school-wide, it's been strictly with our program. But I would say in the last couple years, I know that myself and the staff that I work with have become so much more educated, as have our students. We believe that in the past year we had a student who was trafficked. She is in jail. So that was the question that I had for you. When somebody is so clearly a victim, what is in place to protect them? Because this girl, as soon as she turned 18, she had addiction, and her trafficker was also her boyfriend. They're actually both in jail right now, but it's punitive, and she's not going to get help. And the minute she gets out of jail and he's out of jail, they're going to go right back to each other. And that's heartbreaking. And she's not in our program anymore. She actually was able to graduate. But just wondering why, when somebody reaches the age of 18, jail, that's her answer right now. And she's not getting any real help.
Yeah.
Just wondering if you've seen that as well.
We have, and that story is not uncommon, and it's unfair. There is very slowly an awareness that is growing to create legislation to protect victims who committed crimes while they were victims, and or while they were in the grooming or the stage of being lured into the life. There are not many laws in states on the books about this, but I know, particularly in Colorado, this is a very robust conversation that has started about protecting someone just like that. Because traffickers often, as a grooming process, make those they're grooming commit crimes, right? So because then the victim themselves know that they have this as well to keep them in line, to keep them in the life, because they become afraid of law enforcement and run from law enforcement as opposed to law enforcement.
Exactly. In this case that I'm talking about, not only does she have issues with addiction because of him, but she's been very violent towards law enforcement when they've tried to break things up. So that's why she's where she's at.
And I am extremely grateful to law enforcement. Our whole methodology at the Exodus Road is in collaboration and with the authorities of law enforcement. They are the ones who have the legal privileges to move resources to conduct operations that lead to rescue and arrest. But let me just say my work with IJM and the Exodus Road often, let's say more, I would go with often. Law enforcement has either been blind to the issue, not properly trained in the issue, all the way to complicit, all the way to users of the system. So there is very good reason why many victims are wary of law enforcement. Though I will say, most importantly, our model relies on law enforcement, and there, of course, the majority are law enforcement, which is well-meaning, but has not had the training, does not have the resources to do what they need to do. But to your friend, unfortunately, the laws that are necessary to protect someone like her have not yet been put in place, but I hope one day soon.
Thank you, Amy. Your passion for what you're doing really shows in your speech tonight. I know I've learned a lot. My question is kind of a follow-up to Katie's. Do you know if there is some education in the recovery, drug recovery in the United States? Because a lot of people, I would think, would be coming through these facilities. And I just wondered if some of the people that work in the drug recovery are educated in human trafficking.
Another great question. And again, I'm learning the more I dig into this in the United States that there are industries that are becoming aware of the fact that human trafficking may walk through their front door. So yes, they are getting human trafficking awareness training, whether it be nail salons, whether it be the airline industries, whether it be the hotel industry. I can never say that it's enough or it's soon enough. But yes, so often, the majority of the time, certainly when in sex trafficking there have been drugs and addiction issues, mental illness issues in the mix. So sadly, I think much like our teachers are being, more and more is being asked of you, I think anybody who's working in this field with certain populations, more and more is being asked of them. They're encountering a wide array of issues that are overlapping and interwoven. So yes, there's an awareness that this training needs to be had, but again, never far enough, never fast enough. But I also want to say I am encouraged, though, by what I'm seeing. It's not my intent that we all leave heavy-hearted here tonight, or let's say, at least not only heavy-hearted. I don't think you can sit and hear what we've talked about tonight and not be, but don't leave only heavy-hearted. There are really brave individuals, really well-run, informed organizations, really deeply concerned citizens like yourself who are here tonight who want to learn and want to contribute in some way, shape, or form to stemming the flow of this. And so I live each day hopeful. And at the Exodus Road, we focus on the one. The fact that we've been able over 8 years to rescue 1,100 is more than Matt and Laura Parker ever dreamed of. And they are hopeful. Heavy-hearted, but also hopeful. And big hearts have room for all of that in there. So carry some hope, please, tonight when you leave as well.
Thank you, Amy. Awesome presentation. Thank you all for joining us.